Hi everyone. We're starting a new series talking to New Zealanders and people from overseas about issues which affect them, which affect family, which affect society. And today I am very pleased to have Mark Bridges along. He is the principal of Solway Primary in Masterton. And if you are smart, which I know you are, you've gone, Bridges, why is that ringing a bell? Well, I have to out myself and ourselves. He is my brother-in-law, one of many. But that's not the reason, Mark, we've brought you on board. It's because you are, as I say, a principal and educator over many years. And so it's just wonderful to have you on board. Welcome along.
Thank you, Simon. Look, it's really great to be here on your podcast.
The discussion today, it started actually with Mark and I having a conversation in the kitchen here around structured literacy. And you may have heard some of this in media of late. And structured literacy is something the government's reintroduced, and I want to be clear to listeners here, it's not to wave a political banner one way or another, but what struck me is I didn't actually first and foremost know what structured literacy is. What is it? Why has the government reintroduced it? Talk us through it.
Yeah, so I feel sorry for Simon because his wife and I are both fourth generation teachers. And so when teachers get together, probably like when politicians get together, obviously our discussion goes towards education and kids. So structured literacy, it's actually not as radical as some people would say it is. It's just a progression from what we've been doing. And people talk about the reading wars. So I've been teaching almost 30 years, and reading wars have been going on for my entire career. And that is the debate between what they call whole language approach and the phonetical approach to teaching reading. So that's when you teach a 5-year-old, once upon a time, it was very much the blends and the phonics involved. And then there's this movement of the whole language approach, which certainly was very much in vogue in New Zealand in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And so structured literacy to some degree is a movement back to the old phonetical approach. But I think it would be unfair to say that it's simply a phonetically based system. So the whole language approach, people thinking, what on earth are you talking about there? The whole language approach is an approach of teaching reading to 5-year-olds that is based on the whole word. So children have a reader, we call them PM readers. It's got stories in it that have pictures that relate to the stories and very carefully structured sentences that are contextual to those pictures. In the whole language approach, they talk about the 3 cues. So when children are reading, they don't necessarily know what those words are, but they'll pick up cues from the story. So what's the story about? The story's about ducks. So they'll see a word with one of the cues is what letter does that word start with? D. So, oh, D, this is about ducks. Oh, maybe that word is duck. They'll see a picture of a duck. So that's one of the other cues visually. And then they'll guess those words. In fact, actually, people will tell me off for using that word guess. But they'll consider those words as to the context of the sentence. So they're thinking, oh, I think it might be duck that's coming up here because it's a D word, there's a picture of a duck, and that makes sense with the whole sentence. So that's the whole language approach.
Can I actually jump in there? Because, I mean, you're the expert, but I would use the word guess as well. I mean, what's the pedagogy or the theory in behind the idea that a child would somehow have that word there? Because there's a guess. Why would you think a D word is duck rather than ditch? Or, God, now I'm struggling. Like a 5-year-old. What's the other? I mean, how are they meant to just know this stuff?
Well, that's the devil is in the detail, and that is the point, and that is why there's sort of some movement away from that. To say, though, that that's the way that's reading, the teaching of reading has been done in New Zealand schools is only telling part of the story. In fairness, New Zealand schools on the whole would have had what we'd call a balanced reading approach, where that is part of it, but they've also been teaching the basics of phonics as well. So structured literacy, and I don't know how long it's been around for, but it's more than a decade overseas. Structured literacy has been around, which is very much focusing on, rather than the pictures, rather than the context, just the words themselves, and breaking down the phonetics of those words. But the key is the structured aspect. It is a structured program. So within that structure, there's two key elements. One is the explicit teaching. So explicit teaching of those words and those skills of breaking those words down into phonetic chunks or letter sounds. And then the other aspect is the scaffolding or the structure of when those skills should be taught. So that the real movement here is, I talked about the whole language approach. That's still perfectly valid. And if you think about how you read, you're actually not sounding out each individual letter when you read a word. You'll look at the whole word, you'll look at the context, you'll know what, and automatically you see a word and you're reading about Africa, so you just assume it's elephant. Okay? We do that anyway. Structured literacy is saying, look, we're actually setting kids up for bad habits if we're encouraging them to guess too early. We actually need to go back a little bit, and maybe that guessing part of it, to use layman's term, maybe that's something that should be introduced later, which will naturally evolve once, we've got that. In reading, we talk about mileage. Once they've got that mileage up, that will come later. Structured literacy, and I emphasize too, it's research-based. This isn't just some snake oil salesman selling a new scheme. This is internationally based research in New Zealand, even before the government announcement. So, a lot of education is politically motivated. I have to emphasize 80% of schools in New Zealand were on board with structured literacy before we even had a 2023 election. So most schools are using, I don't know what the current numbers are, but about a year ago, it was 48% of all schools were using one specific program called BSLA. That comes out of Canterbury University, who have a great team. And once again, I'm a principal. I actually don't teach this. Okay. I run the school, deal with the naughty kids, do all those other things. So I haven't been in a new entrant classroom actually teaching reading. The last new entrant that I taught, in that last class I taught, I actually ran into their family a few weeks back, and that student's now doing neuroscience at Otago University. It's quite a while since I've taught new entrants. Anyway, what was I getting to? So this is a research-based BSLA, Canterbury University. Most of the schools that are doing that are already doing that, which is research-based. And so this is just tidying up, I guess, those other schools that maybe aren't on board yet. And there's a few key reasons why structured literacy at this point is really, really important, because it focuses on language. We're seeing things over the last couple of years that we haven't seen before. So, the old rule of thumb is kids are always the same. They've been born for thousands of years. They pop out pretty much the same. A 5-year-old's the same as a 5-year-old, 200 years ago. That's actually not the case at the moment. We're seeing a decrease in oral language. So children aren't using the same amount of oral language that they're using even 5 or 10 years ago. And so children don't have the vocabulary they had even 5 or 10 years ago when they started school. So structured literacy, the way that they really look at word construction, sentence structure, is actually helping with some of those things too.
Just wanted to tease a little bit out there. So we've been talking about obviously structured literacy. So most of us will be thinking it's the written word, which obviously then in terms of speaking. But you're saying that the young ones are not having the same level of oral knowledge or oral. Is that because of perhaps, the usual go-to, social media? Is it also perhaps there isn't the same interactions with family at home, that dialogue across the table? There's probably many reasons, but any research that you've seen that indicates why there's been a decline?
Not a lot at the moment. There's definitely research taking place. Most principals and most schools would have similar stories. And, I'm talking quite generically. We're not talking about every child that comes to school. Schools, and we've brought in place structured literacy. Schools have been doing a great job. Many schools, most schools, in fact, have been doing a really great job, but there are the gaps. post-COVID, in the last few years, we're certainly seeing more children without that oral language. I think it's a mixture of things. I think it's home, potentially some parents spending a lot of time gaming and doing things like that, so there's not the interaction. High usage of devices with children. Children aren't necessarily exposed to books, even from what we'd call highly educated middle-class families. I think the difference between my eldest child and my youngest child, the amount of time they spend actually in books. In fact, my youngest child is a real reader, but we certainly didn't read to her as much as we did for our eldest child. Even to the extent of watching television. Television traditionally, they were focused on children, and Dora the Explorer, Sesame Street, there's still quite a lot of literacy in there. When you're on devices, you know, if it's just a game or something on a device, there may not necessarily be that educational content behind it. And we have to be very real, you know, family breakup, use of, you know, substance abuse in homes, all those factors, they don't influence every child, but those families will have children coming into our schools, and those children, you know, it was unheard of for most schools to have children coming in with, you know, extremely limited oral language even 10 years ago, but that's something every year we've got a few children with extremely limited oral language. I'm not blaming ECEs, but not all ECEs are the same, and it would be naive to think that a child can be in an ECE where they may not have the adult-student ratios from 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock, 5 days a week, and that not have an impact if it's not on top of their game. You know, that said, my children went to an amazing ECE, but they're not all the same. Yeah.
One of the things I noted, again, I'm a layman compared to your good self, is that degradation. But jumping back to the structured literacy side of things, it strikes me as like building blocks. As you say, it's not that you or I or the child's going to phonetically sound every little piece of the word out, but learning phonetically, and you can hear my little bias in this. It makes sense to me that we teach them the building blocks of how to say the word you used, it, elephant, and then over time I get to use it. But so probably the element of whole language that has thrown me is, again, just where is that knowledge initially if you haven't been taught it? It's the chicken before the egg, I suppose. You've got to have the building blocks to then be able to better develop it and understand. But I also pick up your point, Mark, that it's not either or. There's benefits in the whole language approach too, but it just seems to be that the structured literacy, God, even I'm getting tongue-tied, structured literacy and phonetics, it's not completely mutually exclusive, but clearly with the current approach, phonetics or structured literacy is the way to go. And that's on the background. You've touched on the lack of oral knowledge, but is it clear too that basically young people's ability to read, their literacy is pretty bad at the moment overall, and it has been declining for years?
I would certainly declining. Yeah, I mean that there'd be few arguments with that. And as I said before, you know, whole language, while many schools would have taught that, or most schools would have taught that to some degree, you know, most New Zealand schools would have had what they call a balanced approach. So there would have been some phonics. So the structured literacy approach does not necessarily throw out that whole language stuff. It's just saying there are stages, and that's introduced at a later stage. It's all about scaffolding. And, you know, this is research-based, and I emphasise too, I'm not actually teaching this stuff. I'm a principal, so, you know, I'm not in the classroom teaching this, so there'll be some new entrant teacher out there saying, oh, you've misrepresented this, that, or the other thing. But, you know, I'm trying to put it in layman's terms. There's a number of benefits with that structured literacy, though. You know, we're focusing on those sounds. It also has benefits, and one of the reasons structured literacy was really formalised overseas with students that may tend towards dyslexia, and there's a spectrum of dyslexia. So it's been shown to be really helpful with students with dyslexia, and there's some studies going on at the moment, and I suspect the findings will be positive about the use of structured literacy with students for whom English is a second language, because the whole language approach was very reliant on context, on understanding, on that oral background knowledge. But, that's just my observations as an experienced teacher and a principal who sort of pops his head in the door in new entrance classes that are doing it. My school was all on board with structured literacy last year. And the snowball of structured literacy has really been over the last 2 or 3 years. So if there's a political hit job, on the government over structured literacy, that's exactly what it is, a political hit job. This has been coming into play for some time. And because most schools had seen, look, we need to try something different.
So one other thing, well, not one other thing, what plays off, and first and foremost, I know you mentioned a few times you're a principal now, obviously in a leadership role, not as much in front of the class, but importantly, you've done a lot of teaching over the years, and you're bringing that experience. So you just didn't walk into the principal's role. But
no.
I suppose it's the wider then question of just the great value of literacy and reading. And so again, for listeners, Mark and I were having a great chat, which is what facilitated this podcast. So not only the importance of structured literacy, but we were talking about how it's important to be reading at home. In other words, it's not just about the school time. It's about family reading to children. And I'm always remiss, I need to track down this piece of research. But I remember reading years ago that a home filled with books will actually see better literate outcomes for those children. And really strikingly, they don't have to have actually read the books per se. Just the mere presence of them. Now, how exactly that ephemeral works, I don't know. But there's something really vitally important there. And you were stressing to me just how valuable reading at home or being read to is. So just could you tease that out a little bit?
Yeah. So, there's a few things there, and probably about 10 to 15 years ago, many educationalists, and one thing with education, probably like many industries, people jump on bandwagons. There's a trendy thing that comes along, and everyone jumps on that bandwagon. There's not a lot of critical analysis of some of these things that come into play, but the knowledge, the importance of knowledge was heavily questioned about 10 or 15 years ago. And there's a pedagogy, there's a doctrine that really came out saying, look, kids don't need to know all the things they need to know previously, because they can go onto Google now and they can just simply tap something into Google, and that knowledge is not that important. So, but we know that if they don't have the base, if they don't have a certain amount of knowledge to start with, they can Google something, but there'll be no context for that. In reading, we talk about up until the age of 8, we're learning to read, and after the age of 8, we're reading to learn. So reading and the teaching of reading is that tool that we would then use for that further research, for that further acquisition of knowledge. So there's an importance there. The other importance about reading is and writing. And Maria Montessori, who founded the Montessori school, she had a saying, what the hand does, the mind remembers. So the principle of writing, so we talked about reading, obviously structured literacy, and its literacy goes into the writing as well. It's also about how we spell words. By writing things down, that also commits things to memory, that commits things deep into our mind. So I don't know what you do, Simon, but if you're swatting for a test, one of the best ways to swat is to write down those key principles and to commit that to memory.
I'm fortunate that I hate writing. This sounds terrible. Here we are talking about literacy and learning. I'm not a great writer with pen and paper. If anyone has ever seen my handwriting, I should have been a medical doctor. It's indecipherable. For me, I'm quite the reader. Fortunate that if I read something once or twice, I take it on board. But I think one of the things which struck me that you were talking about in that older pedagogy, that children are going to go to Google, for example, or DuckDuckGo or whatever. That's the distinction for me between information and knowledge. So we drown in information in this modern age. It's all around us, but information's not knowledge. knowledge. Yeah, it takes some steps and processing. So maybe I'm old school, the conservative in me, but I like kids to learn mathematics before they hit the calculator. Work out Pythagoras' theorem, not for your year ones, but learn Pythagoras' theorem and then learn to do it on a calculator. The same with writing. Learn, I mean, how many people actually handwrite these days? Very few, but learn to write the alphabet, do your times table, then progress. So again, that distinction between information and knowledge seems to me so critically important.
Mm. Well, interesting you say that. I mean, I'm one of the last of the old school teachers. So I trained as a teacher in the old teachers college back in the 90s. I went to university, then did postgrad for primary teacher at the old teachers college. And when I came out, we did handwriting for about half an hour every morning. But during that handwriting session, we actually did a lot of what the structured literacy content is now. It's breaking down the phonics. We're talking about the importance of reading, and I just have to share this. So we did a reading challenge at our school 2 years ago, where we do it every year now, where we bribe the kids essentially to read every night, to take home a book every night and read it every night. And our school culture, where I am, we have very, very good data, but my AP says there's only a few things that Mark's absolutely, a stickler on. One of them's taking a reading book home every night. And I believe we're down to, there's mixed research, but we're down to only about 30% of schools in New Zealand, primary schools in New Zealand, that send a reading book home every night. So anyway, we had this.
Just want to stress, trying to jump in, just want to stress that, did you say only 30% of schools are actually sending books home with children?
That's right. That's right. And many will do it just for the first year or two, and then it fades out pretty quickly. One of the most common reasons is they lose books, they don't come home. And my personal philosophy is too bad. It's too important not to send books home. Point being, we had this reading challenge, all the great things that we do in the classroom. In our school at that point, and we're a dead average school when it comes to socioeconomics, we have what they call the equity index. We're exactly in the middle. So we're one of the few schools, we have everything in everyone in our school. We've got very poor, very wealthy, everything in between. So anyway, we sent books home every night. We made sure the kids were reading an extra novel every night. They had to do 20 minutes a day. In one term, we went from 11% of the children in our school being above where they should be, not just where they should be, but in the top, 10 or 15% of the country. We had 11% of our kids in that bracket, and we went to 44% of our children in that top bracket of New Zealand. And I just find it interesting as an educationalist, we pour so much time, and we should do, into those that struggle, but we put very little effort into those that are just making, just okay. And actually, as a country, if we focused a bit more those that are doing okay, we could actually have half of them doing brilliantly, but the importance of reading at home, has a huge impact on kids' learning. All the research shows it, but despite all the research showing it, I haven't seen any trendy government policies requiring kids to do reading at home. But all the research backs up that actually, if they're doing reading at home, it will have an exponential impact on school. That said, there are other things tied in with that, parental attitudes to school and to literacy, as you hinted previously. And I know certainly most of the structured literacy programs, and I'll say there are actually over 50 different structured literacy programs. I don't know how many are used in New Zealand, but there are a lot of different programs. More than half, though, are using the one that we're using, BSLA.
That's the one from Canterbury University, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
We're just jumping in for a second. There's no silver bullet, but clearly this, particularly reading at home, you just talked about the increase of excellence in your own school by doing 20 minutes a night. But I assume too, from what you can see, the benefits too of us having the parent or parents spending time with the child, reading, just that, I don't know, that physicality, that presence must have an impact too. So there's probably a whole lot of benefits beyond just simply the literate side of things.
Absolutely, absolutely. That parental attitude to education. Our family, we didn't have a choice. We just had to go to university. It was just not an option. So, that obviously had a big impact on the life path that we as children took. And so parental, and you see that in certain cultures too, where, education is seen as a mechanism to improve not just your outcomes, but the outcomes of those that come after you as well. And, that's as teachers, that's what we believe to be true, and that's why we do what we're doing.
And so as we look at the if you will, overall system, we've obviously talked on literacy, the values that inculcates, obviously the learning itself. Again, I suppose we've touched on just how it creates a little bit, I would argue, a little bit of community as well. I love the fact you use the word bribery, but maybe the words, being a former politician, I'd use the word encouragement, that actually a good friendly rivalry, I suspect, between the students to do well, but all bringing up for excellence. As we're beginning to wrap up, I mean, you've seen other challenges or other things that are going well in the education system that, is relevant to talk around here? Because we often see in the media and the news lots of challenges in the education system. Is it the PISA ratings New Zealanders slide in? I want to be really clear to viewers and listeners, this is going across governments. This is not something that's just happened the last 18 months, 3 years. It's been for quite a while. I mean, what are some of the challenges but also opportunities, Mark, in the education space that you see?
Well, you talk about going across governments. There's a little myth that if a government just changes the curriculum, suddenly everything gets fixed straight away. And you really need to change the profession, and you really need to change what schools are doing. Schools, you're a conservative, and as a conservative, you see what's positive about what's been before, but you're more focused on incremental changes rather than complete revolution. The education system's a little bit like that. We've actually been doing pretty well with most things, but we need to tweak some things. Teacher training is a major issue, that probably one of the few things that every principal that you speak to will agree that teacher training in New Zealand needs to change. It's been very much university academically based, and we've lost a lot of the craft. I know the New Zealand Institute did a study where they found that it was less than 1% of teacher training actually involved the science of learning. And there's lots of focus on lots of other things, but very little on how children actually learn. So I think we do need to look at teacher training. It's a major one. We're talking about reading, but our maths results in New Zealand are even worse, or considerably worse than our reading. In fact, our reading still to this day is one of our highlights. I think we'd probably be in the top 10 of the PISA results of reading. Overall, I think we're 2022, I think we're about 12 or 13, I think, nationally. But our maths results are even worse, and that's because that needs to be structured as well. So structured, they talk about fidelity. So New Zealand schools have one of the biggest gaps between what's happening in classrooms of the same school. So you think, oh, I'm going to send my child to this school, amazing school, but actually every classroom may have a very different program going on, or a very different level of curriculum delivery going on there. So that's something I try really hard to, and many other principals really try to get consistency across those. So we really need to look at introducing a structured maths program, where actually we're going through structured research-based steps rather than just hoping that the kids get it. And that's what the math strategy, certainly, that we've been doing for the last 10 or 15 years, in my opinion, and it's just my opinion, it's been the wish and a prayer curriculum where we just hope kids pick this stuff up. But actually, we need to go back to basics and, go back to the building blocks that over generations have been proven to work.
Well, it's one thing that struck me, well, at least two things, and I hope this is not too controversial. But one element is all this individualized learning, and what I see granted through Rachel and many other friends who are in the teaching profession. They're all, if you will, recreating the wheel. Textbooks in the traditional sense are out. Every teacher's got to create its own or their own teaching materials, which I wonder must have an impact on fidelity, that word you use, that consistency. But the other, and I don't know how to explain this, you'll have the right term, but so much mathematics now strikes me as an English textbook. It's all very wordy and descriptive, and it's like, where on earth is the math in here? It just seems we've lost a few priorities. But I mean, any comment on those two sides of things?
Yeah, I mean, I've taught overseas significantly, and so I taught in the English system for essentially a decade. So that is a much more structured approach. So even though I'm a Kiwi coming back to New Zealand, I do scratch my head at some of the pedagogies, because I've been on the outside looking back in. We do wonder why they've gone down some of the paths they've gone down. So yeah, maths certainly, I have always disagreed with the what they call the math strategy, where a child's allowed to come up with 3 or 4 different ways of working out a problem and then pick their favourite. The highest performing countries when it comes to PISA have a very, very prescribed methodology of working out maths problems. And, you know, the reason that they will work them out in a particular format is because over generations, that has been proven to be the most efficient way of working out what that particular problem is. I've told your wife the story a number of times. I was head of literacy at one of the biggest schools of its type in Auckland for many years, and I used to have all the beginning teachers that I'd do their literacy plans for, and then they'd come to me and ask me about maths. I wasn't the maths person. They're like, what do we do for maths? You know, you've helped us with our reading and writing. What do we do for maths? I'd take them down the back of the resource room, back to the really old dusty from the 90s, and I'd pull out a couple of maths books and go, you start at page 1, and then by the end of the year, you get to the back of the book, and guess what? By the end of the year, they actually would have made some progress. So, you know, I don't understand the thinking of much of our system. There's an insistence that we have to have a uniquely New Zealand system for teaching mathematics. Mathematics is mathematics. It is cross-cultural. If you watch Star Trek, galaxies far, far away will be using, you know, the same mathematic principles that we're using here on Earth and in New Zealand. So we should be less insistent on coming up with our own methodologies and stick to proven techniques that actually work. Yeah, that's my 2 cents worth.
Well, look, this is probably a political point, so I'll tread carefully. But while I love this country, I don't always buy this whole New Zealand's exceptionalism, where somehow everything else in the world is different here. It doesn't matter if it's around medicine through to mathematics and everything else in between. There's so much commonality. And as I said earlier, I'm often struck of how often we seem to recreate the wheel, how much energy is being put in. And I certainly see it with some teachers, that not only the amount of work they're doing to prepare their lessons, but then all the reporting, discussion for another day, enormous amounts of time. And you go, gosh, what would this look like if, you know, said teachers had that time to actually work with the students? Mark.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, I will just say before I go, there are amazing teachers in New Zealand, and most schools are actually doing a pretty good job. The issue is it's varied, and we have to be honest and actually admit that actually not all kids are getting the same deal. You know, not all classrooms are getting the same deal, and the vast majority of schools and school leaders too, you know, we're constantly looking at ways that we can actually get better outcomes for our kids. Yeah.
Well, I think that's actually a really positive place to finish, and I think probably should have said this at the start, but actually incredibly grateful to the teachers, principals like yourself across the country who are working exceptionally hard for our new generation. And while, you know, someone like myself, my personality at times can easily focus on the challenges, I am struck at times by some of the young people, what they know and what they're expressing. It's just like, wow, it's fantastic. So Mark, a big thanks for taking the time to come on board, and for the astute and clear-eyed. They'll notice that he's in the library. That's a coincidence, but I think there's a certain serendipity in that. But Mark, thanks so much for coming on board.
No worries, Simon. Cool. I'll send you the bill later.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Just take a few zeros off.
No worries.